I thought I might try to do something different, um, so that you will have access to these resources tomorrow to see if we are going to make more, um, maybe faster progress than we have so far. So this is Stephen Magu. This is POS 431, and we have been discussing questions of how we think about nature, the state of nature, how we think about states, how we think about what it is, and the different philosophers and their perspectives on the state of nature. And so, in this vein, I kind of wanted to continue that conversation, conclude it, and maybe move on to the next systematic review of the introduction to political philosophy um, that Wolff suggests in his text. So if you do remember, some of the things we've been talking about include, for example, what Hobbes thinks of the state of nature, what rules there are in the state of nature. We were last talking about the rules, the natural laws. We mentioned that there are 19 of them, and so it would be helpful to review those at some point. Today, I wanted us to continue those conversations and think about conflict. So, according to Hobbes, there are three principal reasons for conflict, and these he outlines as we enter conflict for gain, for safety, or for glory. And so he justifies this, as we previously mentioned, by saying that no one is strong enough to ward off all possible attackers. And he actually justifies this by saying we are all almost equally of the same strength. So unless it's maybe a cyclop or a giant. But he also mentions that no one is too weak to attack others or defend themselves with accomplices. And so while attacking is a sure way of getting what others have, do not forget that you can also be attacked for what you have by others in concert with others. And so maybe that's useful, or maybe it's not, because others can attack you too. So how do we get around those kinds of things? Now, one of the ways that he thinks of this is that we form agreements with other people. We agree to be bound by certain rules. Now, so if you read Hobbes, it almost sounds like between the state of nature and human, um, our intrinsic biology, we are made for cruelty, for selfishness, to look out for ourselves. Um, Now, so he again he argues against this and suggests that human beings are not necessarily cruel. That there are very few people who actually who take pleasure in creating harms for pleasure. Now, we cannot um, suggest that no one creates harms for pleasure. Some people like to see other people suffer, but this is not the majority of humanity. Um, some will always fulfill their desires, even when those desires impact on other people. So, to the extent that you are fulfilling your desire, great. But if you are maybe harming other people while you're fulfilling your desire, this he takes offense to. Um, we are not cruel, but sometimes we want stuff other people have, and so we can borrow it if they lend it to us. And sometimes we keep it, and sometimes we attack them and get it, which is probably invites retaliation. Uh, so sometimes we can attack for safety and reputation, and I think sometimes in our communities we are sensitized to, I think, defend ourselves, defend our honor, and so sometimes it's not for gain, it's sort of like reputation. And if you don't fight, then what happens to your reputation? um, so Hobbes unfortunately thinks of war as everyone fighting everyone else in self-defense, which is not necessarily true, because again, if you go back to not everyone fights everyone else, why then would we be all fighting each other? So we previously mentioned that Hobbes appears to be a little bit too suspicious of the human condition. Um, and so we can't, I think sometimes this is a question of, are you a glass half full, glass half empty kind of person? Um, with this, I do not believe there's a society that is so, where everyone is so suspicious as to always be fighting each other. Um, And so, again, we mentioned that according to Hobbes, a state of war is not in the constant fighting, and he justifies this using weather, that foul weather is not always a thing, but weather is always there. Now, whether it actually occurs and prevents us from doing certain things, rain, um, then um, he kind of parallels the state of war with this, the state of readiness to fight. You will also see that Hobbes conflates wars between states. So, for example, the English Civil War with wars between individuals. And I don't know that this is necessarily a good thing. We also talked about, what opinion we express of our neighbors, and one of the things that I think suggests a state of trust or safety or security, or maybe that people have weapons, is that, you'll hear people say we don't even lock our car doors. So the question is, what does that mean for safety and security? So the question then we face is there a role, a place for morality um, in humanity and the interactions? And so it is true that maybe moral creatures might live as Hobbes suggests, but you'll find that few people will actually attack others and take their property, even though there are people who steal and kill, even within the most civilized and richest and wealthiest societies. Um, and so But on the other hand, there's enough sensible people to stop this rot spreading. I think we mentioned previously that if you have watched the movies um, The Purge really is sort of, it suggests that kind of society that, on this one day we are going to do the immoral things. And so I don't think there's any societies with those kinds of immorality, even the worst societies. Um, and so the questions that then we face are, one, is there a sense of morality in the state of nature? And just because there isn't laws or a spelled out duty to do certain things or refrain from doing certain things, does that mean that then we only don't do them because there's laws, or are we driven by morality? Now, in this context, a lot of people argue that it is morality, not necessarily the law, that brings us to not it's to not harm others. We previously talked about Kip, Rudyard Kipling and the idea of civilizing people, and this relates to the idea of the savage man, the questions of civilization. We shall not maybe focus too much on that, but if you do recall, we mentioned the 19 laws of nature that Hobbes suggests exist in every society. And so we kind of did talk about some of these. I encourage you to look back to them. Um, and so again, remember, he says these are not laws given by any authority. These are laws that exist wherever human beings exist. And so you could maybe conflate this with the, or equate them to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. There is actually quite a bit of interesting reading. For example, every man ought to endeavor peace. Um, yeah, a man should be as willing as others to keep the peace. Um, a man if a man be trusted to judge between man and man, he deal equally between them, so not favor in one side. Those kinds of things that we expect. Um, Now, Hobbes suggests that there's no sense of right and wrong in the state of nature. We again remember it's all man, every man for himself. Um, yeah, so the idea that there's no notion of right and wrong, and therefore there's no injustice because there doesn't exist justice in the first place because there's no law. Um, and this is quintessentially his one of his arguments, that if there's no common power that gives law, then there can be no breach of law and therefore no injustice. And since there's also no morality, I think that's a terrible society to live in. Um, we previously mentioned that by deduction, this then suggests that every man has a right to everything, including to another's body. But also remember that he talks about the right to act to preserve yourself, primarily because there's no law to regulate the conduct of men. So Hobbes' state of nature is really a terrible place, and I don't know that anyone would want to live there, even though maybe no one chooses to live there. Um, in the state of nature, we are permitted, well, I take that back. Um, in the state of nature, he suggests that individuals have the liberty to preserve themselves, but also because there's no law, no common power, no breach of law, no injustice, then we take liberty to do that which preserves us, including sometimes taking others' lives, even though that just doesn't sound like a really smart thing to do. Because again, think of retaliation, and are they going to come and retaliate? So yeah, including take other people's lives, which to me sounds like not a great place to stay, to be. So if everyone can do everything they deem fit in the state of nature, um, and also everyone has the right to defend themselves, you can sort of see the chaos that this brings about. And in fact, if you remember our definition of government, Ibn Khaldun, an Arab scholar of, I think he lived about 600 AD, defined government as the entity that abrogates unto itself, doing what it does not allow others to do. So if someone wrongs you, the theory is that you find the proper authorities to deal with this. Um, but also think about what counts as threats, and people's levels of threats are not necessarily the same. Um, and so if you think about, um, and I often give this example, maybe in political science, international relations. If you think about the perception of security, imagine you live with neighbors and they don't always express an affinity to you, and one day you see your neighbor buy a revolver and they're in the yard and they are taking pot shots. It's reasonable to assume that they are practicing for something, and so this might lead you to go and buy your own kind of similar weaponry or bigger. And so this is the condition of mutual suspicion, which is not usually this. There's all kinds of terrible things that can come out of that. But so again, if there's no right or wrong, if there's no moral notions, if justice doesn't exist, um, Now, again, I want us to always remember the reason that Hobbes points this out is that he intends, or he makes the case for the Leviathan. So after he discusses all of this state of nature, then the the Leviathan is the one that comes in to regulate our private violence. So as previously mentioned, the laws of nature, they are what he calls fundamental articles of peace. Codes of law, they arise from reason. They don't arise from any man. These are natural. They are often considered the sources of Hobbes' social contract. If you go back and remember people like Aristotle in his sort of good or the golden mean, but also, if you think about, for example, Hammurabi's law, Hammurabi's code, all of these are sort of seen as natural, even though some of them, relate to human interactions. Um, and so, even then, as going back as far as Aristotle, Cicero, Zeno, and the Greek, actually Hellenic Stoics, they do speak to the value of human reason, conscience, common sense, so that we can judge a person's actions or conduct. And so, according to Hobbes, these laws of nature, we feel them. Nobody needs to teach us. Um, we feel them. For example, it's very few people who just randomly attack someone else for no reason. Now, if they attack for self-defense, that makes sense because again, this is the perception of threat. Um, these laws of nature, these articles of peace, apply to all humans. It's sort of like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. They apply to all men at all times, irrespective of who we are, gender, race, religion, culture, caste, creed, language, and so on. But again, Hobbes, maybe in following with his, I think, pessimistic view of the human being, talks of people being too busy getting food and others too negligent to understand the fundamental law. Uh, but also, and I think he maybe ought to support this finding, if other people get stuff and you can get it from them, why would you then bother to go get the stuff yourself? You just wait for them to get it and then you come and get it from them, it would seem to me. So perhaps they're not just too negligent or busy. Perhaps they also have a plan to do that. So we did talk about the laws, and this is a repeat of the three fundamental. Well, he talks about three, but really there are 19. So we talked about those before, and I urge you to look at our notes. So the idea that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it. If he cannot obtain it, he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. Um, but what if he is the one who started the conflict? Is he then entitled to use conflict that we give up? So the second fundamental law suggests that we give up our right to all things, provided others are also willing to do so as well. This is actually important in the formation of states because then if we give up vices, if we give up the regulation of conflict, and others are willing to do that, and even when there's a disagreement, there's an authority to regulate those, then perhaps the beginnings of state do show up. He also talks about um, performing whatever covenants we make, and I think we have an expectation of those kinds of things. And so the laws of nature, um, for people like Hobbes and even maybe Rousseau, these are given from perhaps from God. That is a concept that they had. Um, And so they're summarized as a moral code, and the traditional golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but sort of like a formulation of the negative: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or in this case, do not do to another that which you would not have done to you. Okay, that's very confusing. Um, but so the golden rule is the moral code. Um, and so if we have moved from the just being a thing that we do to now the golden rule is a moral code, does then Hobbes argue that there's a moral code? And how is there a moral code if we are still in the state of nature without actually having a Leviathan? So yeah, he contradicts himself, I think. Um, that there's no right or wrong in the state of nature. What is right and wrong is what you feel is necessary for you to survive, but you should not do unto others that which you wouldn't have them do unto you. Yeah, so theorems or conclusions of reason, um, but whatever he calls them, whether it's a moral code, um, then we conclude that following those moral codes or those rules is good for you because it helps in your self-preservation. So maybe you don't need to default to conflict. Yeah, sometimes these philosophers can be very cyclical in their, shall we say, arguments. So, um, state of nature. So there's a bit of other contradictions that I'll just briefly mention. So, by the fundamental law of nature, it is rational to seek peace because the state of nature is a state of war. But also, sometimes rationality may require war or peace, depending on whether you feel threatened or not. Um, yeah, but so collective rationality is not always a good thing. Actually, if you ask citizens questions about what you think or what they think is good for the country, you might get some shocking answers. We have mentioned Agrabah and how we were going to invade it. But also, we have to think about those contradictions that, so what is good for you may not be good for the, well, what do they say? What's good for the goose and the gander? Um, and the example of cutting down trees on a hillside might be good for you, but think about the rainfall, think about planting and those kinds of things. So again, what I think benefits me may not benefit perhaps or sometimes we don't even think about the greater harms. Um, I hesitate to use something like COVID, but imagine I live near a forest and I regularly catch bats for some reason. Actually, I recently saw a Thai woman, maybe, who was making bat soup. But what they may not think is that that might be harmful to other people. So it may be good for them to drink bat soup, which is, ooh, but so again, collective, individual rationality and what is good for one person may not be collectively good. And I think some of the things that we have spoken previously about with respect to this, and I'm not taking a position on vaccinations or not, is when you think about if someone is not vaccinated against one thing and it's a contagious thing, what might not be good for them then is not great for everyone else. A lot of this rationality is represented in Prisoner's Dilemma. We briefly mentioned Prisoner's Dilemma. Two people are arrested. They both promise to go free if they tell on the other. Um, And so if they cooperate, if both talk, then the idea is that the police know everything, and so everyone gets a worse deal. Now, if you are told that your friend has been telling them what happened, um, you're more likely to be like, oh, they sold me out, and so maybe I'm going to tell them, and the police are depending on that. So think about those kinds of decisions that people have to make. What is the best individual welfare? Now, in Prisoner's Dilemma, this you might run into with political science, international relations. Um, it's generally assumed that the best strategy, the best joint strategy is to say nothing. The worst joint strategy is for each of the accused to tell all, because then everyone knows everything and whoops. Um, so perhaps going back to the laws of nature, um, should it then be everyone's duty to obey the laws of nature? Um, and should we obey the laws of nature only? Should we obey them all the time? We or some of the time when it relates to other people. We briefly talked about this with, how do we break laws? Please don't answer that. Do we break laws? Do we obey laws because it is the right thing to do, or because we are afraid of punishment, or because of the moral effect? Um, and so, if you're going to give up certain things because you trust in the law, you should, in theory, desire that they work the same way for everyone. Um, but again, when you think about obeying the law, what if the law goes against the natural order, or it goes against the laws of nature? And it is very easy to see, for example, things that could go against the laws of nature. If you think back to the Fugitive Slave Act, um, did it then, if you knew someone had run away, there was laws, but the law of nature would demand that that person be treated as a human being. And so should we always obey the law? Um, if you're rushing someone to hospital, should you obey the law and drive a certain speed? Um, and so, according to Hobbes, it's stupid and self-defeating to obey some of those laws, particularly if other people are disobeying them. So you become a sucker. Um, Now, sometimes some people obey all the laws, even if they become suckers, because their internal compass tells them that that is the right thing to do. And what do you do in those kinds of situations when it doesn't really hurt anyone? So, but according to Hobbes, we should avoid being suckers if we are obeying laws and no one else is. And so he brings up sort of this matrix of, if I follow the rules, there's peace. If I don't follow the rules, I am a predator, especially when others are either following or maybe not following the rules. Um, and so this matrix is actually very representative of quite a number of things. But if I don't follow the rules and others don't follow the rules, imagine what kind of chaos might be there. If I follow rules and others don't follow the rules, then I become prey. So I become the sucker. Um, but the challenge to this is, um, if you're living in a state of nature and there's no one to enforce the rules, then this matrix applies. But um, even if you follow rules that are there, but they are against the laws of nature, what does that then mean? And so these are determinations I think sometimes we have to make, including, shall I follow the rules, or shall I follow the laws of morality? And so Hobbes makes clear that anyone obeying in these circumstances will make himself a prey and procure his certain ruin. Um, Now, so the Hobbes makes clear that it is our duty to obey the laws of nature when others around us do, and when our compliance is not exploited. But perhaps there's also the question of whether those rules are enforced by the Leviathan. But if we are in the state of nature and everyone is, king unto himself, um, and so he also suggests that the level of mutual suspicion and fear is so high we can generally be excused for not obeying the law in the state of nature. Because again, who is to enforce these laws? Or are you just going to be the sucker? So this is where, and I think this is where we have previously stopped, where Hobbes thinks of a way out of these predicaments, of these contradictions. And so the creation of a ruler, or what he calls the Leviathan, becomes important. And so the Leviathan, a lot of people will define the state as citizens giving up the private violence so that the violence is enforced by one sovereign leader, government, one that can compel us. And so this is Hobbes' ultimate point, that there needs to be a ruler, a sovereign, who will punish those who disobey the law, um, and is not acting as though they're about to attack others. And you may know this of the US being almost always accused of trying to invade other countries. Um, So the way Hobbes sees the Leviathan is that the Leviathan creates the conditions in which people are bound by and follow laws, and if they don't, they are punished by the Leviathan. So the Leviathan creates the conditions under which people can securely follow the laws of nature. Um, so now we see the origins of Hobbes' Leviathan.